The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned crisp and clear over Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell had been looking forward to a quiet Sunday, perhaps catching up on correspondence or taking a walk along the harbor. Instead, he found himself clinging to the twisted metal of the USS Arizona's superstructure as Japanese bombs tore through the heart of the Pacific Fleet. The attack came in waves, like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. Mitchell watched in horror as Zero fighters swept down from the sky, their engines screaming like banshees. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire immediately, filling the air with a thunderous barrage that should have torn the enemy planes to pieces. Thousands upon thousands of rounds streaked skyward, creating a deadly web of steel and fire. But the Japanese pilots moved through it all like phantoms, untouchable and precise. They banked and rolled with an almost supernatural grace, their bullets finding American targets with devastating accuracy while the defenders' shells exploded harmlessly in empty air. Mitchell counted at least 30 direct hits that should have connected, shots that any reasonable person would have sworn were perfect, yet the enemy planes continued their deadly work unscathed. The Arizona shuddered beneath his feet as another bomb found its mark. Through the smoke and chaos, Mitchell could see other ships suffering the same fate. The Oklahoma was already listing heavily to port, her crew scrambling across her tilting decks. The West Virginia burned like a torch, sending black smoke billowing across the harbor. And still, the American gunners fired desperately at targets they couldn't seem to hit. As the attack finally ended and the harbor fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the crackling of flames and the cries of wounded men, Mitchell made his way through the wreckage. He had survived, but barely. The image of those dancing Zero fighters would haunt his dreams for months to come. How could trained American sailors, men who had spent years perfecting their gunnery skills, miss so completely? What invisible force protected the enemy while leaving American forces so vulnerable? Meanwhile, thousands of miles across the Pacific, Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy was recording his own observations in his personal diary. By candlelight in his cramped quarters aboard the carrier Akagi, he wrote with careful brushstrokes about the day's remarkable success. The American gunners fire like blind men in a storm, he noted with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine puzzlement. Their weapons are powerful, their ammunition plentiful, but their aim lacks the precision of the samurai sword. They spray bullets at shadows while the real target slips past untouched. Yamamoto had expected fierce resistance over Pearl Harbor. American military might was legendary, their technology advanced, their sailors supposedly well-trained. Yet, during the attack, he had watched his fellow pilots perform maneuvers that should have been suicidal, flying through what appeared to be certain death only to emerge unharmed on the other side. The Americans seemed to be fighting an enemy they could not see, could not predict, could not touch. Back on the American mainland, in a cramped laboratory tucked away in the basement of a nondescript building at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Robert Chen was about to begin another 18-hour day. The Chinese-American scientist had been working on what the Navy dismissively called his radio detection project for over a year now, pouring his heart and soul into equations that most military leaders considered pure fantasy. Chen's laboratory was a maze of vacuum tubes, copper wiring, and mysterious devices that hummed and clicked throughout the night. His assistant, Private Martinez, often found the young scientist collapsed over his desk in the early morning hours, muttering mathematical formulas in his sleep. The work was consuming Chen's life, but he knew, with the absolute certainty that only a true scientist could possess, that his radar-guided gun system could change the course of the war. The problem was convincing anyone else to believe in his vision. Admiral Thompson, the gruff Navy official responsible for approving research funding, had made his position abundantly clear during their last meeting. "Dr. Chen," he had said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "the United States Navy has been sinking enemy ships and shooting down enemy planes for over a century without the aid of invisible waves and electronic wizardry. This radar nonsense of yours is expensive foolishness, nothing more. But Chen knew better. He had seen the reports from Pearl Harbor, had studied the damage assessments and casualty figures. American gunners had fired an estimated 10,000 rounds during the attack, yet fewer than a dozen Japanese planes had been damaged, let alone destroyed. Traditional gunnery methods, which relied on visual tracking and manual calculation, were simply inadequate against the speed and maneuverability of modern fighter aircraft. The early tests of Chen's prototype system had been discouraging, almost disastrously so. The radar could barely track a lumbering transport plane moving in a straight line, let alone a nimble fighter performing evasive maneuvers. The targeting computer, built from surplus telephone switching equipment, calculated firing solutions so slowly that enemy planes could complete entire attack runs before the system provided usable data. Private Martinez watched his exhausted superior night after night, seeing the toll that constant failure was taking on the brilliant young man. Chen would work until he literally collapsed, then wake up a few hours later and immediately return to his calculations. His dedication was absolute, but the institutional blindness that surrounded them seemed equally immovable. While American sailors died in the Pacific, bureaucrats in Washington continued to debate budget allocations and question whether invisible radio waves could really guide bullets to their targets. The invisible enemy that threatened to destroy them all was not just the Japanese military machine, but also the inability of American leaders to see beyond their own limited experience and embrace the revolutionary potential of new technology. The enemy we cannot see will kill us all before we learn to fight back. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Pringle Hall at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, as Captain William Hayes stood before a room full of skeptical officers. The year was 1942, and America was reeling from devastating losses across the Pacific. Hayes had requested this emergency meeting to discuss new technological developments that could turn the tide of the war, but the faces staring back at him showed nothing but contempt. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere, "we must consider every advantage available to us. The enemy has shown remarkable tactical superiority in aerial combat, and our current methods of anti-aircraft defense are proving inadequate." His words carried the weight of personal tragedy. Just 3 months earlier, his son, Lieutenant David Hayes, had died at the Battle of Midway, shot down while attacking the Japanese carrier Akagi. Admiral Morrison, a grizzled veteran of the Great War, shifted in his chair with obvious irritation. His weathered hands gripped the edge of the mahogany conference table as Hayes continued his presentation about radar-guided gun systems being developed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The concept seemed to offend Morrison's very soul. The idea that American sailors needed machines to help them aim their weapons was an insult to naval tradition. "Captain Hayes," Morrison interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain, "are you seriously suggesting that we abandon proven methods of gunnery for some Buck Rogers fantasy? Our gunners have trained for years to master their craft. They know wind, they know lead time, they understand ballistics better than any machine ever could." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Colonel Patterson from the Marine Corps leaned forward, his scarred face twisted in a scowl. "I've seen what happens when men become dependent on gadgets, Hayes. They lose their edge, their instincts. You're talking about turning our sailors into button pushers instead of warriors." Hayes felt the familiar ache in his chest, the same pain that had consumed him since receiving the telegram about David's death. His son's final letter, written just days before the battle, haunted him still. "Dad," David had written in his careful script, "these Japanese pilots are unlike anything we trained for. They move like they know exactly where our bullets will go, like they can see the future. We need something better than what we have." "Admiral Morrison," Hayes said carefully, "I understand your concerns about tradition and training. But we're losing pilots, losing ships, losing this war because we refuse to adapt. The radar-guided gun system could give our gunners the precision they need to. Quote, "Enough!" Morrison's fist crashed down on the table with such force that coffee cups jumped and papers scattered. His face had turned red with rage, the veins in his neck bulging as he stood to his full, imposing height. Real men use iron sights, not magic boxes. Our fathers and grandfathers defended this nation with courage and skill, not by hiding behind machines. I will not see the United States Navy turned into a collection of technicians playing with expensive toys. The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes could feel the weight of disapproval pressing down on him from every corner of the room. These were men who had built their careers on tradition, on the belief that American fighting spirit and superior training could overcome any enemy. The suggestion that they needed help from machines was more than just tactical disagreement. It was heresy. 3,000 miles away, on the flight deck of the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, a very different kind of training was taking place. The ship cut through the Pacific swells with graceful efficiency, her deck crews working in perfect synchronization as they prepared for the morning's flight operations. Lieutenant Commander Kenji Nakamura, the carrier's senior pilot instructor, watched with satisfaction as his young aviators performed their pre-flight checks. Nakamura had been flying for 15 years, since the early days of naval aviation when pilots were considered daredevils and madmen. He had survived the transition from fabric-covered biplanes to sleek metal monoplanes, had mastered carrier landings when such feats seemed impossible. Now, at 38, he was responsible for training the next generation of Japanese naval aviators, and he took that responsibility with deadly seriousness. "Listen carefully," Nakamura told the circle of young pilots gathered around him on the hangar deck. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt spray, familiar scents that had become the essence of home for these men. The Americans have superior numbers, superior industrial capacity, and superior firepower, but they have one crucial weakness: they fight like machines. The pilots leaned in closer, their faces eager and attentive. Most were barely 20 years old, fresh from flight school with perhaps 50 hours of carrier experience. They looked up to Nakamura with the reverence typically reserved for gods or emperors, and he understood the weight of their trust. "When an American gunner aims his weapon," Nakamura continued, sketching diagrams on a small blackboard, "he calculates lead time, wind speed, altitude. He follows a mathematical formula, tries to predict where you will be when his shells arrive. This makes him predictable. He drew intersecting lines showing attack angles and defensive fire patterns. Watch for the muzzle flash. Count the rhythm of their firing. Then break your pattern just as they pull the trigger. They cannot adjust quickly enough when you change from predictable to unpredictable." One of the younger pilots, Ensign Yamamoto, raised his hand tentatively. "Sensei, what if they improve their training? What if they learn to aim as well as we do?" Nakamura smiled with the confidence of a man who had shot down 7 American aircraft in the past 6 months. "Impossible, Yamamoto-kun. Americans are soft, dependent on their machines and their comfort. They lack the spiritual discipline required for true precision. A Japanese pilot fights with his soul, his ancestors guiding his hands. An American fights with his head, calculating and overthinking. The soul will always defeat the mind." The other pilots nodded solemnly, absorbing this wisdom. Nakamura had become something of a legend throughout the combined fleet for his theories about American weaknesses. His tactical innovations had been copied by squadrons across the Pacific, and his success rate in combat was extraordinary. But with success had come a dangerous certainty, a belief that Japanese superiority was not just tactical, but inherent. "Remember," Nakamura concluded, "every time you evade their fire, every time you strike their ships while they fumble with their equipment, you prove the superiority of the Japanese spirit. They may have radar, they may have more guns, but they will never have our dedication, our purity of purpose. This is why we will win this war." Back at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Chen stood in his laboratory surrounded by the wreckage of his latest test. Smoke still rose from the burned-out components of his radar array, and the acrid smell of electrical fire filled the air. The prototype system that had consumed 18 months of his life lay in ruins, destroyed by a catastrophic feedback loop that had occurred during what should have been a routine calibration. The test had started perfectly. His radar-guided gun system had successfully tracked and locked onto 3 different target aircraft, maintaining contact even through complex evasive maneuvers. For a brief, glorious moment, Chen had believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough that could change the course of the war. Then the friendly bomber had appeared. The B-25. Mitchell had been conducting a routine navigation exercise, following a flight path that should have kept it well clear of the test range. But weather had forced the pilot to deviate from his planned route, bringing him directly into the area where Chen's prototype was operating. The radar system, designed to track any aircraft within its range, had immediately locked onto the bomber and designated it as a hostile target. In those terrifying seconds, Chen had watched helplessly as his creation prepared to fire on American aircraft. Only quick thinking by his assistant, who had yanked the power cables from their sockets, had prevented disaster. The B-25 had flown on, its crew never knowing how close they had come to being shot down by their own side. But the damage to Chen's project was immense. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, Chen's departmental supervisor, surveyed the destroyed equipment with barely concealed satisfaction. Blackwood had opposed the radar gun project from the beginning, considering it a waste of resources that could be better spent on more traditional weapons research. The near accident had given him exactly the ammunition he needed to shut down Chen's work permanently. "This is precisely what I warned you about, Chen," Blackwood said, his voice cold with professional disapproval. "These automated systems are inherently unreliable. They cannot distinguish between friend and foe, cannot make the moral judgments that human operators take for granted. You nearly killed American airmen today with your miracle weapon." Chen stood amid the ruins of his laboratory, his white coat stained with soot and his hands trembling with exhaustion. For months he had worked 16-hour days, driven by the knowledge that American boys were dying in the Pacific while he struggled to perfect his invention. Every delay, every setback felt like a personal failure, another day when pilots like Captain Hayes' son would face Japanese aircraft with inadequate defenses. "Dr. Blackwood," Chen said quietly, "every prototype has problems. Every new technology requires refinement. Edison didn't create the perfect light bulb on his first attempt. The Wright brothers didn't fly perfectly at Kitty Hawk. This is how progress works. Through failure, through learning, through improvement. This is not about progress, Chen. This is about responsibility." Blackwood picked up a fragment of the destroyed radar antenna, examining it with disgust. "You're asking us to entrust the lives of American servicemen to a machine that cannot tell the difference between a Japanese Zero and an American bomber. That's not innovation, that's negligence." The laboratory door opened with a sharp bang, and Navy Secretary Frank Wallace strode into the room flanked by 2 junior officers. Wallace was a political appointee with no technical background, but he controlled the funding for Chen's project. His visit had been scheduled as a demonstration of the system's capabilities, a chance for Chen to prove that his work deserved continued support. Instead, Wallace was witnessing its complete failure. "Dr. Chen," Wallace said, his voice carrying the authority of a high office, "I came here today expecting to see this miracle weapon I've been hearing about. Instead, I find a laboratory that looks like it's been bombed." He gestured at the destroyed equipment, his expression shifting from disappointment to barely controlled anger. "Do you have any idea how much money the Navy has invested in this project? How many senators I've had to convince that radar-guided guns are worth pursuing?" Chen straightened his shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. "Mr. Secretary, science is not a straight line from problem to solution. Every breakthrough requires experimentation, and experimentation inevitably includes failure. What happened today teaches us important lessons about target identification, about friend or foe recognition systems. These are solvable problems. Solvable? Wallace laughed bitterly. Doctor, we don't have time for solvable problems. While you're playing with your gadgets, Japanese pilots are shooting down American aircraft with alarming efficiency. Our anti-aircraft gunners are missing their targets. Our ships are being sunk. Our boys are dying. We need solutions now, not promises about future breakthroughs. The words hit Chen like physical blows. He thought about the reports he read each morning, the casualty lists that grew longer each day. He knew that Captain Hayes had lost his son at Midway, knew that dozens of other families were receiving terrible news while he struggled with technical problems that seemed increasingly insurmountable. "Mr. Secretary," Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I understand the urgency. I feel the weight of every delay, every setback, but the principles behind this system are sound. Radar can track aircraft more accurately than human eyes. Computers can calculate firing solutions faster than human minds. The technology exists. We just need time to refine it, to make it reliable." Wallace shook his head slowly, his decision already made. "Time is exactly what we don't have, Doctor. I'm recommending that funding for this project be suspended immediately. The Navy needs practical solutions, not expensive experiments that nearly kill our own people." As Wallace and his entourage left the laboratory, Chen stood alone among the wreckage of his dreams. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, coating the MIT campus in pristine white. But Chen felt only darkness, the crushing weight of failure and the knowledge that American pilots would continue to face Japanese aircraft with inadequate defenses. In the distance, he could hear the sound of aircraft engines, probably another test flight from the nearby airfield. Each engine note reminded him of the urgency of his work, of the young men who depended on innovations like his to keep them alive in combat. The mockery he faced from traditionalists like Admiral Morrison, the skepticism of administrators like Dr. Blackwood, the political pressure from officials like Secretary Wallace, all of it seemed overwhelming. But Chen was not a man who surrendered easily. As he began cleaning up the debris from his failed test, his mind was already working on solutions to the problems that had caused the disaster. Friend or foe identification systems, improved target discrimination algorithms, better safety protocols. The challenges were enormous, but they were not impossible. The winter wind rattled the laboratory windows as Chen worked late into the night, driven by a vision of American gunners who could match the precision of Japanese pilots, of radar-guided weapons that could protect the ships and aircraft of the Pacific Fleet. His colleagues might laugh at his efforts, his superiors might question his methods, but he refused to accept defeat. "They laugh at science today," Chen whispered to himself as he sketched new designs in his notebook. "But tomorrow, they will beg for miracles." The USS Lexington cut through the Pacific swells like a steel cathedral, her flight deck stretching nearly 900 feet into the gray March morning of 1943. Below deck, in the newly installed Combat Information Center, Seaman First Class Tommy Rodriguez stared at a piece of technology that seemed borrowed from a science fiction magazine. The radar screen glowed an eerie green, casting ghostly shadows across his young face as he tried to make sense of the manual's technical jargon. Rodriguez had grown up fixing radios in his father's shop in San Antonio, but this was different. Dr. Chen's Witchcraft guns, as the crew had dubbed the new radar-guided anti-aircraft system, represented a quantum leap from anything he'd ever seen. The 20-year-old sailor had been pulled from kitchen duty just 3 days earlier when the regular radar operator came down with appendicitis. Now, with Japanese reconnaissance planes spotted 200 miles out, he was about to become the eyes of the entire ship's defense system. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. Every sweep of the radar beam revealed more contacts approaching from the northwest. Small blips that represented Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers, each one carrying enough explosive power to send the Lexington to the bottom of the Pacific. Rodriguez's hands trembled as he adjusted the controls, trying to remember the crash course instructions he'd received from the departing technician. Captain James Hayes stood behind him, watching the screen with the intensity of a predator. Hayes had made a career-defining decision that morning. He would trust Dr. Chen's revolutionary technology completely, ordering all gunners to fire only when directed by the radar system. The crew's reaction had been immediate and hostile. These were men who had survived Pearl Harbor, who trusted their eyes and instincts above all else, and now their captain was asking them to become slaves to a glowing screen. Chief Petty Officer Sean Murphy, whose weathered hands had operated naval guns since the Great War, voiced what many were thinking. "Captain, with all due respect, I've been shooting at planes since before this kid was born. You're asking us to ignore 30 years of experience for some college boy's gadget." His Irish accent thickened with frustration as he gestured toward the radar installation. "What happens when that thing breaks down? What happens when we're sitting ducks while Rodriguez here tries to remember which button to push?" The tension in the Combat Information Center was thick enough to cut with a knife. Veterans exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their faith in the new system. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared at the approaching enemy contacts with grim resignation. They had fought the Japanese before, but never while deliberately blinding themselves to trust in an untested machine. At 0847 hours, the first wave appeared on the horizon. A formation of 24 aircraft flying in tight V patterns, their rising sun insignia barely visible through the morning haze. Traditional doctrine would have had every gun on the ship opening fire the moment the planes came within range, filling the sky with a deadly curtain of lead and steel. Instead, Hayes maintained his order: wait for the radar's guidance. Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead as he watched the enemy contacts close the distance. The radar painted a precise picture of the incoming attack: altitude, speed, bearing, even the individual aircraft positions within each formation. But translating that information into targeting data for the gun crews required split-second decisions and absolute precision. One mistake, one misread contact, and men would die. The moment of truth arrived as the Japanese planes began their attack runs. Rodriguez's voice cracked over the intercom system as he called out bearings and ranges to the gun crews. "Contact bearing 270, range 8,000 yards, altitude 4,000 feet, closing fast." The 5-inch guns swiveled with mechanical precision, their barrels tracking targets that remained invisible to the human gunners operating them. When the guns opened fire, the result was unlike anything the crew had ever witnessed. Instead of the usual wild spray of shells hoping to create a killing zone, each round seemed guided by an invisible hand. The first Japanese bomber exploded in a brilliant orange fireball before its pilot could even begin his dive. The second and third followed within seconds, their wreckage trailing smoke and flame as they plummeted toward the ocean. The enemy formation disintegrated under the surgical precision of the radar-guided fire. Planes that had seemed untouchable moments before became falling coffins, their crews never understanding how they had been detected and targeted through the cloud cover. The few aircraft that managed to release their ordnance found their bombs falling harmlessly into the sea, their aim disrupted by the unexpected ferocity of the defense. Rodriguez watched the slaughter unfold on his screen with growing horror. Each disappearing blip represented human lives, young men not unlike himself who had kissed their families goodbye and climbed into their aircraft believing they were striking a blow for their emperor. The clinical efficiency of the radar system stripped away all pretense of honor or glory from combat, reducing warfare to a series of mathematical calculations displayed in phosphorescent green. As the last enemy aircraft turned away or fell burning into the Pacific, an eerie silence settled over the ship. The gun crews stood at their stations in stunned disbelief, hardly able to comprehend what they had just accomplished. They had achieved a perfect victory. Not a single Japanese bomber had successfully attacked the carrier, while their own casualties consisted of nothing more than some scorched paint and ringing ears. But Rodriguez felt no joy in the triumph. The young sailor from San Antonio had discovered something terrible about modern warfare. Killing could be reduced to reading numbers on a screen and pushing buttons in response. The human element, the skill, courage, and personal risk that had defined combat since the beginning of time, had been eliminated by technological precision. 6,000 miles away, in the War Ministry building in Tokyo, Colonel Kenji Tanaka was receiving the first fragmentary reports from the few pilots who had survived the attack on the American carrier. Their accounts seemed impossible. Guns that fired with perfect accuracy through cloud cover, defensive fire that anticipated their every move, an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their approach. "The American devils have found a way to see through the sky itself," radioed Lieutenant Yamamoto, one of only 3 pilots to return from the mission. "Their guns knew where we were before we knew where they were. It was as if they could read our thoughts and see our souls." The Japanese High Command dismissed these reports as the ravings of traumatized airmen. Admiral Yamamoto himself had warned that Japan could only fight America for 6 months before industrial capacity would shift the balance, but few believed that technological advancement could change the nature of warfare so dramatically in such a short time. The reports were filed away, categorized as pilot stress reactions, and largely ignored. Rodriguez remained at his station as the Lexington resumed normal operations, but something fundamental had changed within him. He stared at the now quiet radar screen, its green glow no longer mysterious but somehow malevolent. He had crossed a line that morning, becoming something new and terrible in the evolution of warfare, a technological executioner who killed at a distance, guided by electronic signals rather than human judgment. The implications terrified him more than any enemy attack could have. If war could be reduced to reading instruments and following procedures, what did that say about the value of human courage, skill, and honor? What did it mean for the future of conflict when killing became as simple as operating a machine? As the radar screen continued its endless sweep, painting the empty ocean in electronic green, Rodriguez whispered the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I have become death's accountant, counting souls through a green glass window." The morning sun cast long shadows across Rabaul Air Base as Major Saburo Ishikawa adjusted his flight goggles one final time. At 32, he was already a legend among Japanese naval aviators, 50 combat missions, 12 confirmed kills, and a reputation for bringing his men home alive. The ground crew bowed respectfully as he approached his Mitsubishi, A6M0, its polished aluminum skin gleaming like a samurai's blade in the tropical light. Today's mission would be different. Intelligence reports indicated a massive American fleet had been spotted near Guadalcanal, centered around the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Ishikawa had studied the reconnaissance photographs carefully. The Americans were growing bolder, their ships venturing closer to Japanese-controlled waters with each passing week. It was time to remind them that the Imperial Navy still ruled these skies. "Ishikawa-san," called Lieutenant Kenji Ito, his wingman and closest friend. The young pilot's face bore the eager expression of someone who had yet to witness the full horror of war. "The Americans won't know what hit them today." Ishikawa nodded grimly. He had learned long ago that overconfidence killed more pilots than enemy bullets. The Americans were no longer the fumbling amateurs they had been at Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were improving, their tactics evolving, and their equipment becoming more sophisticated with each encounter. Still, Japanese training and Bushido spirit had carried them this far. The squadron of 18 Zeros lifted off from Rabaul's dusty runway at 0800 hours, climbing steadily toward their cruising altitude of 20,000 feet. Below them, the Solomon Islands chain stretched like emerald jewels across the azure Pacific. Ishikawa had flown this route dozens of times, but today something felt different. The usual radio chatter among his pilots seemed more subdued, and even the weather appeared ominous, dark clouds building on the horizon where their target waited. As they approached the coordinates provided by reconnaissance, Ishikawa spotted the American fleet through breaks in the cloud cover. The Enterprise sat at the center of a protective formation, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers arranged in concentric circles. Smoke rose from the carrier's stack, indicating she was making full speed, probably launching aircraft of her own. "All aircraft, this is Dragon Leader," Ishikawa radioed. "Execute attack pattern Yamato. Remember your training and bring honor to the Emperor." The Zeros peeled off in formation, diving toward the American ships with the screaming fury of falling meteors. Ishikawa felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as his airspeed indicator climbed past 400 knots. This was the moment he lived for, the pure, crystalline instant when skill, courage, and fate collided in mortal combat. Then the impossible happened. The American ships opened fire while the attacking aircraft were still miles away, far beyond the effective range of conventional anti-aircraft guns. Ishikawa watched in stunned disbelief as tracers arced through the sky with mechanical precision, seeking out his aircraft through the thick cloud cover. This wasn't the wild, desperate flak he had grown accustomed to. This was something else entirely. Lieutenant Yamamoto's Zero, flying 200 meters to Ishikawa's left, suddenly erupted in flames. The pilot never had time to scream. The aircraft simply disintegrated, its burning fragments spinning toward the ocean below. But how? The plane had been completely hidden by clouds when the American guns opened fire. "Dragon Leader!" Ito's voice crackled over the radio, tight with panic. "They're tracking us through the clouds. How is this possible?" Before Ishikawa could respond, another Zero exploded in a ball of orange flame. Then another. The American gunners seemed to possess supernatural vision, their weapons finding targets that should have been invisible. Bullets tore through the darkness with the accuracy of a master archer, striking vital components with surgical precision. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Corporal Danny Walsh pressed his eye to the radar scope, watching as green blips representing enemy aircraft moved across the circular screen like moths drawn to flame. The new Mark 37 gunfire control system had transformed the ship's anti-aircraft batteries into instruments of devastating accuracy. Where once gunners had fired blindly into empty sky, hoping for lucky hits, they now possessed the eyes of gods. "Bearing 285, elevation 15 degrees, Walsh called out, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around the ship. "Range 8,000 yards and closing fast." The 5-inch guns swiveled smoothly, their barrels tracking targets invisible to the naked eye. Radar pulses bounced off the attacking Japanese aircraft, returning precise information about their speed, altitude, and heading. Mathematical calculations that would have taken minutes to perform manually now happened in seconds, translated into firing solutions with mechanical efficiency. Dr. James Chen stood behind Walsh, watching the radar operator work with the focused intensity of a surgeon. The physicist had spent months aboard the Enterprise, fine-tuning the radar systems and training the crew in their operation. The technology was revolutionary, radio waves that could penetrate clouds, darkness, and weather to reveal the exact location of enemy aircraft. To the Americans, it was simply applied science. To their enemies, it must seem like witchcraft. "Direct hit on target bearing 270, reported Gun Director Phillips. "She's going down in flames." Chen felt a familiar mixture of pride and unease. His equations were working perfectly, translating theoretical physics into tactical advantage. Yet watching enemy pilots die, young men not unlike himself, left him deeply troubled. War had a way of turning scientific triumph into moral complexity. In the cockpit of his diving Zero, Major Ishikawa fought to maintain control as shrapnel from a near miss peppered his aircraft. Half his squadron was already gone, shot down by weapons that seemed to possess demonic intelligence. The Americans were firing through solid cloud cover, hitting targets they couldn't possibly see with conventional methods. His pilots' radio calls had devolved into desperate prayers and accusations of supernatural intervention. "The Americans have sold their souls to demons," Lieutenant Ito screamed over the radio. "No human gunner could shoot like this." Ishikawa wanted to disagree, to maintain the disciplined calm expected of a squadron leader, but the evidence before his eyes defied rational explanation. American bullets were tracking his aircraft through the thickest cloud cover, adjusting their aim as he maneuvered, striking with the precision of guided missiles. This wasn't lucky shooting. This was something beyond human capability. He pulled his Zero into a desperate spiral, diving toward the ocean surface where the strange American weapons might lose their supernatural vision. Behind him, 2 more aircraft exploded in brilliant fireballs, their pilots vanishing without even a final radio call. Whatever dark magic the Americans had unleashed, it was decimating his squadron with ruthless efficiency. The few surviving Zeros limped back toward Rabaul, their formation shattered, their confidence destroyed. Ishikawa counted only 6 aircraft remaining from his original 18, the worst losses he had ever sustained in a single mission. The silence on the radio spoke volumes about his pilots' shattered morale. Rabaul Air Base appeared through the afternoon haze like a mirage, its familiar runway offering sanctuary from the nightmare they had just escaped. Ishikawa's Zero touched down with smoke trailing from multiple bullet holes, its engine coughing like a dying man. The ground crew rushed forward with fire extinguishers, their faces grave as they counted the missing aircraft. In the debriefing room, the surviving pilots gathered around a scarred wooden table, their flight suits still damp with sweat and fear. The air hung heavy with the smell of aviation fuel and defeat. Flight Commander Ogawa, a stern man who had never lost faith in Japanese superiority, listened with growing incredulity as Ishikawa described the mission. "You're telling me," Ogawa said slowly, "that American gunners shot down 12 of our finest pilots through solid cloud cover? That they hit targets they couldn't possibly see?" "Aye, Commander," Ishikawa replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Their weapons possessed unnatural accuracy. They tracked our movements as if they could see through the clouds themselves." Lieutenant Ito nodded vigorously. "It was devil magic, sir. No human technology could accomplish such feats. The Americans must have made some unholy bargain with dark spirits." Ogawa's face flushed red with anger. "Enough! I will not tolerate such superstitious nonsense from elite Imperial Navy pilots. You suffered casualties because of poor flying and American luck, nothing more. To suggest otherwise dishonors the memory of our fallen comrades." The cultural implications ran deeper than mere tactical analysis. For decades, Japanese military doctrine had emphasized the spiritual superiority of their forces, the idea that Bushido spirit and divine protection would triumph over Western materialism. To admit that American technology had achieved the impossible was to question the very foundations of their worldview. "But sir," Ishikawa persisted, "the precision of their fire was beyond anything we've encountered. They struck vital components on aircraft they couldn't see, adjusted their aim in real time as we maneuvered. This was not random shooting." "Are you suggesting," Ogawa replied coldly, "that racially inferior Americans have developed weapons superior to those of the Divine Emperor? That their mongrel democracy has produced technology beyond the reach of our sacred empire?" The question hung in the air like incense in a temple. To answer yes would be to admit defeat not just tactically but culturally and spiritually. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had given the Americans capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away aboard the USS Enterprise, Corporal Walsh was celebrating with his radar crew in the ship's mess hall. Beer had been smuggled aboard despite regulations, and the men were toasting their successful defense of the fleet. The new radar-guided guns had performed flawlessly, shooting down enemy aircraft with an efficiency that would have been impossible just months earlier. "Did you see that Zero at bearing 285? Seaman Rodriguez laughed, gesturing with his beer bottle. "One second it was diving through the clouds, the next it was scattered across the ocean in pieces." But the celebration was interrupted when Chief Petty Officer Morrison burst into the mess hall with a handful of intercepted radio transcripts. The ship's communications specialists had been monitoring Japanese frequencies during the battle, translating enemy transmissions in real time. "You boys might want to hear this," Morrison announced grimly. "The Japs are calling our radar guns witch weapons. They think we've made some kind of deal with the devil." The laughter died instantly. Walsh stared at the transcript, reading translated excerpts of Japanese pilot communications. Words like demon magic, supernatural accuracy, and unholy spirits appeared repeatedly. The enemy couldn't comprehend the scientific principles behind radar technology, so they were interpreting it through the lens of superstition and fear. Dr. Chen, who had been quietly nursing a cup of coffee in the corner, felt his stomach clench with unexpected guilt. He had created these systems to save American lives, to give their forces a technological edge in the brutal Pacific campaign. But he had never considered the psychological impact on enemy pilots, young men who were dying not just from American bullets, but from terror of the incomprehensible. "They can't understand the science," Chen murmured more to himself than to the assembled sailors. "To them, our radar must seem like magic, like we violated the natural order." Captain Morrison nodded soberly. "Intelligence says Japanese pilot morale is plummeting. They're requesting transfers to other theaters, claiming they won't fly against supernatural weapons. Some are even committing seppuku rather than face our radar-guided guns again." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their technological triumph was achieving something beyond mere tactical victory. It was breaking the enemy's will to fight. Japanese pilots, renowned for their fanatical courage and determination, were being psychologically shattered by weapons they couldn't comprehend. Chen stood and walked to the porthole, gazing out at the darkening Pacific. Somewhere out there, in hidden bases and airfields, enemy pilots were struggling to understand what they had encountered. Young men like Major Ishikawa, veterans of countless battles, were questioning everything they believed about warfare, technology, and the natural world. The physicist reflected on the broader implications of his work. Throughout history, advanced technology had often been mistaken for magic by those who lacked the scientific framework to understand it. When European explorers brought firearms to primitive societies, they were often worshipped as gods wielding supernatural power. Now, the same dynamic was playing out in reverse, American scientific advancement appearing supernatural to an enemy whose technological development had followed different paths. As the Enterprise steamed through the tropical night, her radar arrays sweeping the sky for new threats, Dr. Chen contemplated the terrible responsibility of scientific innovation in wartime. His equations and engineering had created weapons of unprecedented accuracy, but they had also unleashed psychological warfare on a scale no one had anticipated. The Japanese weren't just being defeated, they were being driven to madness by their inability to comprehend the forces arrayed against them. In his final log entry that night, Chen wrote, "We have achieved total technological superiority over the enemy, but at a cost we never calculated. Our science has become their superstition, our precision their terror. We are winning this war not just with superior weapons, but with incomprehensible magic, at least from their perspective." The next morning would bring new battles, new encounters between American technology and Japanese mystification. But tonight, as radar waves pulsed invisibly through the darkness and enemy pilots tossed sleeplessly in their bunks, the Pacific theater had been forever transformed by the collision of science and superstition. When science becomes indistinguishable from magic, fear replaces courage in the bravest hearts. The bamboo walls of the prison camp creaked in the humid Philippine air as Captain David Morgan shifted on the dirt floor of his cell. 6 months had passed since his P-51 Mustang spiraled into the jungle. its engine torn apart by what should have been impossible, ground fire that found him in complete darkness. Now he shared his cramped quarters with an unlikely companion, Lieutenant Yamada, a Japanese pilot whose Zero had met the same mysterious fate just weeks earlier. Yamada's English came in broken fragments, mixed with frantic hand gestures that painted pictures his words could not. American. Kami. Spirit guns, he whispered, his eyes wide with something between fear and reverence. He drew circles in the dirt with a stick, pointing skyward, then made explosive motions with his hands. No see, but see everything. Demon eyes. Morgan watched, fascinated despite himself, as Yamada described encounters that perfectly matched his own final moments, the impossible accuracy of ground fire in pitch darkness, the way American guns seemed to track aircraft through clouds and smoke. But where Morgan understood radar-guided anti-aircraft systems, Yamada saw supernatural forces. The Japanese pilot spoke of Oni, demons, that guided American bullets, of cursed weapons that could see through solid matter. "You think we have magic?" Morgan asked, genuinely curious. Yamada nodded solemnly. "Your people. Different spirit. Very strong." Half a world away, in a windowless room deep within the Pentagon, Major Franklin spread intercepted Japanese communications across a steel table. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he studied message after message that revealed a pattern both fascinating and disturbing. Radio chatter from Japanese squadrons spoke not of new American technology, but of supernatural warfare. "General, you need to see this," Franklin said as MacArthur's intelligence chief entered the war room. The major held up a decoded transmission. "Japanese pilots are performing ritual purifications before missions. They're carrying blessed amulets. Their commanders have ordered sake offerings to appease what they call American spirit weapons." The intelligence chief leaned over the documents, his brow furrowing. "They're treating our radar systems like—" "What, exactly?" "Like magic, sir. They've stopped trying to understand the technology. Instead, they're fighting what they think are supernatural forces." Franklin pulled out another report. This squadron diverted an entire bombing run because their leader claimed American demons were watching from the clouds. As Franklin continued his briefing, a chilling realization emerged from the data. The psychological impact of America's radar-guided guns far exceeded their actual military effectiveness. Japanese pilots, unable to comprehend technology that seemed to violate the laws of physics as they understood them, had convinced themselves they faced powers beyond human understanding. Fear spread through their ranks like wildfire, not fear of death, which every warrior accepted, but fear of the incomprehensible. The most disturbing revelation came buried in classified American reports. Some commanders had deliberately encouraged these superstitious beliefs, spreading false rumors about secret weapons and supernatural capabilities. Psychological warfare specialists had recognized the opportunity and seized it, feeding the enemy's confusion with carefully planted misinformation. In his laboratory thousands of miles away, Dr. Chen Chen read these same classified reports by lamplight, his hands trembling slightly as he turned each page. His radar-guided gun system, born from pure scientific curiosity and wartime necessity, had become something he never intended. The equations on his blackboard, the careful calibrations, the precise electronic circuits, all had been transformed in the enemy's mind into instruments of mystical terror. Chen set down the papers and stared at his prototype gun, its metal surface gleaming in the dim light. He had solved complex problems of target acquisition and ballistic computation, creating a marvel of engineering that could track and destroy aircraft with unprecedented accuracy. But in doing so, he had also created something else entirely, a weapon that fought not just with bullets and explosives, but with the most powerful force of all, the human imagination. The radar-guided guns were never just about accurate shooting. They had broken the enemy's will to fight by making them believe they faced forces beyond human understanding. The technology had become a mirror, reflecting back not American scientific achievement, but Japanese cultural fears and spiritual beliefs. In trying to defend against the incomprehensible, the enemy had defeated themselves. Chen picked up his pen and wrote a final entry in his research journal, his words heavy with unintended consequence. We set out to build better mousetraps and accidentally created monsters in our enemy's imagination. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It draws on historical themes of technological advancement, fear, and the clash between innovation and tradition in wartime. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire reflection on how perception, technology, and power shape human conflict.